talking today about free will, chapter 8, the 8th chapter of True Christian Religion. And I just wanted to start with how Swedenborg begins this chapter. Just listen to what he says. Before even preparing to present what the new church teaches regarding free choice, I must lay out what the church of today says about it in its doctrinal texts. Otherwise, devout and rational readers may think there is no point in me trying to write something new about it, since they would say to themselves, who doesn't know we have free choice in spiritual matters? Why else would ministers preach that we need to believe in God, turn ourselves around, live according to the precepts of the Word, fight against the lusts of our flesh, and prepare ourselves as new creatures, not to mention many other things of the same kind? They cannot avoid the conclusion that if there were no free choice in matters of salvation, such words would be nothing but hot air, and that it is insane to deny free choice because such denial goes against common sense. In other words, he's saying, why is this chapter even necessary? So what he then does is he quotes from what's called the Formula of Concord. Now, this is a text that was written in 1577. It's an authoritative Lutheran statement of faith, and it makes up the final section of the Lutheran body of doctrine known as the Book of Concord. Now, it's split into two parts. The first part is like a summary, and the second part is a much more detailed exposition of the matter. I'm not going to quote it, and if you want to read what Swedenborg quotes from it, you can do so in the book. But I will show you what the main 12 articles that come out of this Formula of Concord. Now, I want you to notice that the second article, the second part, is free will, which is our title today. So it begins with original sin and moves on to free will. And what Swedenborg does when he quotes from this text, he's not only quoting the section on free will, but he's quoting from all over this document. And he's contrasting his understanding of free will with what's presented in this document. What I found really interesting about skimming through this first summary is we find in this document familiar terms that Swedenborg uses. So, for example, the as of self, as of oneself principle, which if you've read Swedenborg, you're familiar with that term, as of oneself. But you also come across terms like actives and passives. And this is the same language Swedenborg is using in this chapter. So if you really want to understand the chapter on free will that Swedenborg writes, it's worth having a quick dive into this first. But I will say Swedenborg objects to this, and he objects to it very strongly. He writes this, and just notice the language that he uses. Truth appears in the light when two forms are set side by side like this. Just as sometimes in paintings a misshapen face is placed next to an attractive one. Since we can see the faces at the same time, the beauty of the one and the ugliness of the other stand out clearly before the eye. So he's less than complimentary about this document. He's got one major criticism of this, and that is that as you read through this, you get the sense that you are actually completely helpless. There is nothing you can do whatsoever about your destiny, if you like. You have no free will or choice. You are just a machine following a pre-programmed pattern. The other thing that I pick up from this is that it does present two different pictures of humankind. So one is the regenerate person, the person who is destined for heaven, the person who's got it right. And then there's the unregenerate person who is destined for hell. And it recognizes the fact that we need to move from one condition to the other, but it has no sense of how you actually do that. Swedenborg doesn't deal with that particular issue in this chapter. That's for later. That's a sense of where we're going next. But he does deal with the free will issue and this idea of helplessness. What I find interesting about it, looking back at a document that was written, where are we, 500 years ago? Getting close. The church at the time argued for what we'll call a spiritual determinism. In other words, this idea that you have no control over your ultimate destiny. That's where the church was at, and that's what Swedenborg's arguing against. They even go so far as this doctrine of predestination, the idea that God created you with a destiny in mind, and that's where you're going, whether you like it or not. What I find interesting about that is if we consider our own time and we look at the sciences of today, more and more we're finding ourselves in a situation where science is telling us that we are just programmed to live out our lives in a certain way. It might be through our genetic code, it might be through our biochemical reactions that go on in our body. Science treats us as machines, as though we have no choice, no agency in what we do. And I just find that's an interesting shift that has taken place in the couple of hundred years since Swedenborg was writing. Before I move on from this, what I want to say is the key difference, the fundamental difference between this and Swedenborg's work is where they begin. Lutheran doctrine begins in the failure of man, our failure as a human race, and this idea of original sin, and then it moves on to free will. Swedenborg begins here. He begins in divine love. It says there are three things which make up the essence of divine love: loving others than oneself, wishing to be one with them, and devoting oneself to their happiness. So that's the essence of love, and that is the nature of God. If that is the nature of God, it seeks a relationship with us. And in order to have a relationship, we can't have a relationship with something that does not have free choice. If you get married in Australia, one of the things that a marriage celebrant must do is determine that both of the people in the relationship come together of their own free choice. Because marriage isn't marriage without mutual love, the mutual decision of both parties to come together. And the same is true of divine love. Divine love seeks a relationship with us and can only do so by giving us free will to choose that relationship in return. Now we see it in that passage that I read from Exodus, the free will offerings that are brought by the people for the worship of the creation of the tabernacle. So this again is our understanding of worship from that divine love, that the Lord doesn't demand worship of us because he's got a huge ego. The Lord asks worship of us because it's an expression of our relationship with the Lord. And that's all it is. And so it's interesting to note that the tabernacle itself, the tent that the Jews created for the heart of their worship ceremony, was built entirely of things given of free will. There was no demand of it. It was, this is what we need. Does anybody want to put their hand and supply it? See, it was built on free will. And we can go further with this idea of love and what it's for, and realise that something that I said again several months ago, that divine love is the reason the universe was created, and it is the order in which it is maintained. In this chapter, Swedenborg writes this: God himself is the design, or order is the word that's often used there, order. God himself is the order. Because all things were created by God, they were created by the design, in the design and for the design. And he goes on, there is also a design into which humankind was created, which is that whether we are blessed or cursed depends on our own exercise of free choice in spiritual matters. Now I'm going to read a different section from this same paragraph. People who have become earthly because of false beliefs about the spiritual teachings of the church, cannot help thinking that divine omnipotence is above and beyond the design of the universe, and therefore that divine omnipotence exists outside that design. As a result, they lapse into deranged thoughts, such as the following: why did the Lord come into the world, and why was this a redemption, when God's omnipotence could have allowed him to accomplish the same thing from heaven as he did on earth? Why wouldn't he, through his redemption, have saved the entire human race down to the last person? So it's the idea that God could just snap his fingers and make it all right. But Swedenborg's idea from this passage is God is the design, and he can't contradict the design because he contradicts himself doing so. So the natural man, he says, thinks of divine omnipotence without order, as though God and the universe are quite separate. But that's not the case. And we see it too in the idea that, God could have created a universe in which there was no suffering, for example. That's a debate I've had in recent days. Because a universe that's created must abide by certain laws. Otherwise we don't learn about the world around us. Imagine if I walked into the wall, and just because I walked into that wall, it makes space for me to pass through, or it suddenly becomes soft so I don't hurt myself. It's a nonsense, it's ridiculous. But that's where we can go, that's what we can think. Now, what is the freedom of choice we're given? Well, the freedom of choice is what Swedenborg calls a spiritual equilibrium. And he uses this picture of a tug of war, of two opposing forces that are pulling against each other. And if you like, it's the power of heaven on one side and the power of hell on the other. And it's perfectly balanced, such that if you were to stand in the middle and hold onto the rope, your effort, however small, would influence which direction the rope moves because of that balance. That's the picture that he paints. And he says this, a lovely passage, one of my favourites, from Divine Providence: the Lord protects our freedom the way we protect the pupil of our eye. He also says that all the freedom that comes from the Lord is true freedom, and the freedom in us that comes from hell is slavery. That's a little bit counterintuitive sometimes to us, because we like to think that the way we do things, we want to do our things our way. Well, that feels like freedom to me. But he's saying, no, actually, there's something deeper than that. It reflects the words that the Lord said in John chapter 8, "If you abide in my word, you are my disciples indeed, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Again, I'm going to read a section from Swedenborg. This time it's from Arcana Celestia. He writes this: once someone has been regenerated, he enters for the first time into a state of freedom. Previously, he has been in a state of slavery. It is slavery when evil desires and falsities predominate, freedom when affections for good and truth do so. As long as he is in a state of slavery, a person never perceives what his situation is. Only when he enters a state of freedom does he start to do so. When he is in a state of slavery, that is, when evil desires and falsities predominate, the person who has become subject to them imagines that he is in a state of freedom. That, however, is sheer falsity, for he is at that time being carried away by the delight that accompanies desires and resulting pleasures, that is, by the delight accompanying the loves that are his own. And because he is being carried away by such delight, it seems to him as though he were a free man. And so we have in Swedenborg then a concept of what we call self-compulsion. It's the idea of recognizing that sometimes the things that I want are not the best things for me, and then to be able to consider and counter that force, that pull. So Swedenborg writes this, and this is again back to true Christian religion. If we absorb the spiritual teachings of the Church and restrain our free choice accordingly, we are then led by the Lord away from cravings and evil pleasures and our native eagerness for them, and we strive for what is good and turn away from what is evil. And we are brought into heavenly freedom, which is true freedom. And I just want to finish really by just observing that freedom is a double-edged sword in many ways. It grants us both power and responsibility. You know, we like to think of ourselves as able to determine our own destiny, to travel our own path through life. We object strongly when we even get the slightest hint that someone's trying to take our freedoms from us. We rail against that. But then notice how quickly we are to fall back on the idea that, oh, my genes made me do it. Or, you know, my biochemistry made me do a certain thing or lash out in a particular way or whatever it is. So we have this love-hate relationship with our freedom. And so I'm just going to ask you in the week ahead, just reflect upon your experience of your freedom. Do you truly embrace it? Or do you have this, as I say, love-hate relationship with the desire to control and go about life your own way, but then on the other hand relying on the usual defences and excuses we call upon when things don't go our way or when we don't behave perhaps as well as we should?